Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today we're discussing coral conservation and the biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef, presented by Bruce Patterson and Dr. Dean Miller. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. Bruce, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kendall. Yep. So I'm Bruce Patterson. I'm a guide naturalist with Natural Habitat Adventures. But that's enough about me, and let's get on with this project. So in 1998, I did a multi-day dive trip in North Queensland, and the operations manager became a great friend of mine after I had done subsequent trips, John Romney and his better half, Linda Romney. John ran his trips in an effort to encourage citizen science as well as just diving. So there was always a bed free for a researcher on his trips. One day, this young fella, Dean Miller, popped up, and Dean was doing his field work for his PhD. And subsequent to that, Dean and I have become great friends and buddies, and misbehaved quite a bit together. In 2014, John, Linda, and Dean put their heads together, and they set up an NGO to assist researchers in gaining access to the Great Barrier Reef, because sadly the Australian government was not doing sufficient in that respect. In 2016, they set up an NGO called Great Barrier Reef Legacy, and that has taken off and been quite a success. But sadly, we lost John in 2020, and the baton has been handed over to Dean, who has been doing a wonderful job since then. So to introduce you to Dean, Dr. Dean Miller, he's a scientist, a multimedia professional. He's an international television presenter, an Australian Geographic sponsored explorer, a creator and lead scientist of the Living Coral Biobank project that you're going to hear about. And Dean is also a highly respected voice and conservationist for all things Great Barrier Reef. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you, Bruce, and lovely to be with you on the other side of the world this morning. So I'm presenting from North Queensland, Great Barrier Reef. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you about what's happening on the Great Barrier Reef at the moment, and our main project called the Living Coral Biobank project at Great Barrier Reef Legacy. And I'll take you through a journey really of how we got to needing to protect the biodiversity of corals and holding them in preservation for tomorrow. And I'll try to finish up relatively early, because when I do these talks, I realize that a lot of people have a lot of questions, and I think it's the question time that I really enjoy the most. And it's a great opportunity for you to delve a little bit deeper into this topic, because it is quite an interesting one. I guess when I started out as a marine scientist, I never considered that I'd be creating or building a biobank of any type of description. Back when I started in 1999, the Great Barrier Reef was in fantastic condition, and you know, it was all just about, I guess, trying to explore as much of the natural beauty as possible, trying to see as many different environments, habitats, species, ticking off the list, which is where I met Bruce, really working on the research vessel. You know, we were interested in sharks and manta rays, and I guess coral was not even on my radar. I'd get in for a dive, and I would kind of just overlook the coral and go looking for the big stuff. And over time, it's become apparent how important the coral is to a coral reef. And you know, it's funny to be able to say that, but you know, you can't have a coral reef without coral. And over the last 6 or so years on the Great Barrier Reef, things have become, I guess, a little heightened in terms of our need to do something. And coral has become my absolute focus, which is an interesting twist for me, because I started as a marine biologist wanting to work on great white sharks, because you know, who doesn't? But now it's coral. So I'm going to lead you through the Living Coral Biobank project. And as I said, there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. Alrighty, so let's have a look at the science behind what's been going on. So in the last 6 or so years, the Great Barrier Reef has experienced 3 mass coral bleaching events. And I say 6 because we need to include this year now, when it should be really 4 mass bleaching events, because we're currently going through one right now in the central Great Barrier Reef. Now, when you throw into consideration what's happening with the bleaching and the last 20 or so years of crown of thorns impact, low water quality, and cyclone damage, we've lost 50% of coral cover and abundance. So that's a huge amount of coral gone from, you know, what is the biggest Great Barrier Reef or coral reef system on the planet. Now, we also need to recognize that this is not just restricted to the Great Barrier Reef. This is worldwide. So every coral reef region on the planet has experienced some level of bleaching that we see in this photo, some much worse than others. And in areas, we've actually lost entire reefs and reef systems. So, you know, I guess the Great Barrier Reef in the scale of things, or relative to other reefs, are actually doing quite well. And that's because it is actually so big. So it's a little sad to see that this is now a global phenomenon, up there with melting ice caps, and is really connected very strongly to global climate change. But each time we see an additional coral bleaching event, what we're doing is actually losing the most vulnerable corals and reefs. So they're the coral species that aren't able to put up with these heat stress events, are actually doing worse. And you can see a particular type of coral in this photo, a branching type of coral that isn't actually doing very well. So when bleaching occurs, what happens is the water is too warm for too long, and the color within the coral, and we need to remember that the coral is actually an animal, and the color within that animal is an algae that lives within the coral tissue, providing that coral with about 90% of its food source through sugar production. So when we see bleaching, the coral actually ejects that algae because it's creating a toxin, and it loses effectively 90% of its food source. When that happens, the coral is effectively starving, and if the water stays too warm for too long, the coral dies. If the water drops, the water temperature drops, the coral can actually take up the algae again and recover to a degree. Now, when I say recover, it does survive, but it is impacted in the following season for its breeding events in coral spawning. So even though it is a recovery, it's not a full recovery. So we needed to realize that if we're going to protect the biodiversity of corals, we need to act immediately. This is happening really, really quickly now. And in the last 6 or so years, it's really ramped up. So things are getting quite critical. But why protect coral biodiversity at all? Well, we need to take a step back and have a look at what coral actually does for coral reefs. Now, I said earlier, corals are the building blocks of coral reefs, and they absolutely are, and you can't have a coral reef without coral. And I kind of liken a coral reef system to a game of Jenga. And if anyone's played Jenga, it's that tower of blocks that you stack up, and as you pull individual blocks out, that tower gets a little bit wobbly, and if you pull too many blocks out, it'll actually fall over. So if you consider that some of those blocks at the bottom of the tower will be coral species, and as you move up through the tower, you can have fish, mollusks, all the different types of organisms that you find on a coral reef. If you eventually pull those blocks out, the coral reef system will fall over, and we see a shift in ecosystem function. So what generally happens is you start off with a very vibrant coral reef system, and as you take species away, what eventually happens is an algal dominated system will take place. And when the algae moves in, it's very, very hard to replace that with coral, because algae is so good at dominating the landscape with real estate. They just grow so quickly. So it's almost impossible to come back from that algal dominated state. And that's what we're seeing in some places around the world where bleaching has taken place, where there's very heavy fishing pressure, and especially fishing pressure along the entire, I guess, spectrum of fish, from herbivores to predators. So when you take herbivores away, you don't have that ability to clean up or mop up that algae that's being created so quickly. So on the Great Barrier Reef, thankfully, we have very good fishing management, and we don't see a big loss of our herbivores, in which case, when we have a bleaching event, the algae production is there, but thankfully the fish are there to relatively mop it up. So we're still in balance at the moment. So without coral diversity, we won't have the same ecosystem that we see at the moment, particularly on the Great Barrier Reef. So we need lots and lots of different corals to have lots and lots of different animals all the way up in that food web. Healthy coral reefs are crucial for the survival of over 1/4 of ocean organisms. Now that's incredible, given that coral reefs really occupy 0.1% of the ocean area. So just that tiny amount of area leads to the production or support of over 1/4 of the world's ocean species. So coral reefs are extremely, extremely important. They're actually essential to life on Earth. So this is just another reinforcing, I guess, idea that, you know, if we lose coral reefs, we're going to lose something very, very critical in our world, in our ecosystem, in the Earth's ability to function as we know it. And then if that's not enough, every single day, over 1 billion people worldwide are dependent on healthy coral reefs for their survival and well-being. So that's people who live around the equatorial zone, who don't have electricity, don't have refrigeration. They need to catch fish every single day for their families. And if you're in somewhere like Papua New Guinea and you live on a little island, places that I've visited before, you'll have to catch additional fish to then go back to the mainland and swap for things like firewood and vegetables. So, you know, it's absolutely critical for these people to be able to continue to feed their families. And we're talking 1 billion people, so that's a hell of a lot of people that will be displaced. So if you think COVID, for instance, has been a big social upheaval, imagine if we lose coral reefs around the world, what that means for all these people, and where are they going to go? What are they going to eat? So it's really, really crucial that we get this right and try to halt, if not reverse, the loss in biodiversity and coral cover and abundance. So at Great Barrier Reef Legacy, we have run major expeditions, 5 major expeditions so far. And what we try to do really is give support to researchers, as Bruce said in the intro, to try to work out what's going on, especially on the Great Barrier Reef, in the Northern Great Barrier Reef at the time in 2016 and 2017, where the first really severe bleaching events took place. And what we did is we were given this lovely boat, thankfully from a philanthropist, plus a big bundle of money, and we're able to offer free berth spaces to researchers from all over the world to come out and do their research and try to work out, what corals had survived those bleaching events, which corals didn't. So really running an overall reef health check, and then trying to work out why certain corals were surviving. So you can see here a little lab type scenario. Believe it or not, that's in a marble bathroom inside that ship, and the ship manager was quite shocked at the fact that we were setting up a little laboratory there, but they were very excited once they could see what was going on. That's looking at the biology and physiology of corals that had survived bleaching events and what makes their ability to do that more than other coral species. So that was an interesting type of project. But really, that's just focusing on 1 or 2 species. You can see to the top right there, we're actually flying out live coral colonies of an Acropora species, Acropora tenuis, which is what we consider to be the super coral. No matter where we went in that far northern Great Barrier Reef and how much bleaching we saw, that particular species made it through. So that was an important species to try to see and understand how it was making it through these heat stress events. So we were flying live corals, probably 1,500 kilometers back to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, so they could run experiments on those corals and again, work out what was going on. And then to the lower right there is the cryogenic program, where they've been collecting I guess, tissue samples from coral species, and I think they've done about 16 to 20 coral species now, and they're able to freeze them in liquid nitrogen in a particular way in the hope that in the future they can reanimate those tissues and actually bring corals back to life. So kind of like a Jurassic Park type of moment. So through these expeditions, what we were finding is that there are great projects out there, absolutely, and they hold great promise, but they're working on very, very few species. And they're also, you know, 2, 5, 10, 20 years from coming off in fruition from being able to actually save big expanses of the Great Barrier Reef and coral reefs worldwide. So what we then needed to do was take a step back and say, well, what are we going to do right now to save the coral biodiversity immediately? And so we came up with the Living Coral Biobank project. So this was something that we could actually carry out right at this moment. There's no lack in technology. This is a very well-honed science and technique. And basically all we're doing is going out there and collecting all living species of corals, initially on the Great Barrier Reef, but we'll extend this to the rest of the world. Now there's 400 or so species on the Great Barrier Reef and an additional 400 to 600 species around the world. So that's about 1,000 species total. And it's fairly easy to collect these. And then what we do is keep them alive in land-based facilities. So over the last 40 or so years, the coral aquarium industry has basically honed the science, techniques, and experience in how to keep corals alive very, very successfully. So it's really this hobby that has allowed this project to occur. So this is really different because what's happening is the scientists are catching up to the hobbyists. So thankfully, people who have been keeping corals alive in their lounge rooms, in their offices, in their garages, in their sheds, all around the world have actually worked out and cracked the code on how to keep corals alive. And corals really need some fairly basic things to stay alive. You're kind of replicating the ocean, not only the ocean, but also the sun. So we keep temperature very stable, we keep nutrients very, very low. Obviously the water quality has to be very good, and then you have to replicate the ocean through special UV style lights. So it's almost like creating a life support system for individual coral fragments. And as you can see in the picture here, the coral fragments don't have to be very big. They're only about 10 or so centimeters or an inch or so, and that represents that colony. And corals in particular, if we were to look at the entire animal kingdom, are almost the perfect animal to have a living coral biobank scenario, because corals actually live for hundreds, if not thousands of years under the correct conditions. So they are absolutely perfect. So as long as we keep giving them, good water, low nutrients, good sunlight, they will continue to live for thousands and thousands of years. And they do that on the Great Barrier Reef and around the world right now. And they're some of the bigger colonies that you can see. Obviously, this is a living collection, so it'll actually grow and double in size, which is very, very exciting. But let's have a look at another model just to show you what this scenario is kind of like for us. So some of you will know about the Global Seed Vault in Svalbard, which looks after the world's crop seed collection. So should we have a catastrophic event, should we have a monoculture of wheat, for instance, die out in the world's crops, we can actually go back to the seed vault, grab some seeds, and then replant those areas. So it's a safe storage area, and that's exactly what the Living Coral Biobank is for corals. So these two facilities kind of function in exactly the same way. They're long-term storage solutions. For seeds, obviously that's a little bit easier. You just need to keep your seeds very, very cold and viable. For corals, we actually need to keep them alive. So it's a little bit more intensive. But what we're actually effectively doing is protecting the genetic and species biodiversity of the things that we're looking after. So for seeds, for crop seeds, obviously you have to have enough genetic diversity within that species to actually go out there and reproduce the crops. And for corals, it will be exactly the same. So we have to have a certain amount of representatives for each coral species within that biobank system to be able to go out and do restoration style activities. But we also want to provide samples and genetic material to researchers and restoration style projects. So not only will the Coral Biobank be a repository of the living fragments of the world, but we'll also supply tissue, genetic material, skeletons, and living fragments to reef research and restoration efforts. So this is really important. You can't rebuild reefs if you don't have that living stock. So effectively, that's what we're doing. So how do we do it? If we look at the Great Barrier Reef on the left there, it's a very, very big system, 344,000 square kilometers. So we're talking about a very big space to try to collect from. Approximately 400 or so species of coral. And what we actually do once we find the coral species that we're looking for is only take half of the colony. Why we do that is we want to leave that genetic material on the Great Barrier Reef, while we only need a representation of the living, I guess, colony itself. And corals, another very interesting animal. God, they're just so interesting in so many ways. They go through asexual reproduction or cloning. So a coral polyp will actually start an entire colony, which is when you have coral spawning. It'll land, it'll create another one, those two will create another 2, and 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and that's how a coral colony forms. So when we actually halve a colony, that will grow back. So they're very, very clever at recreating themselves. So we take a subsample. What our plan is to actually get the entire collection, so all 400 or so species, and then within that 400 or so species, we want multiple representatives from each species. And what we need to do is not just have 10 or so representatives from species A from one reef. We actually need a full geographic spread of the genetic representation to have within species biodiversity that is connected to geographic distribution. Because if you think of a species living at the northern end of the Great Barrier Reef, it will be used to water temperatures of around probably 30, 32 degrees in summer, while that same species found at the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef will be used to temperatures of around 26 degrees. So you can see that there's a thermal difference along the length of the Great Barrier Reef, and within that thermal difference you have genetic differentiation within the species. So we want to capture that. So that's really, really important. Once we're back at the lab, things get a little bit more interesting. We actually take that parent colony on the left, and if we move up and to the right a little, what we actually do is break that down into about 10 individual fragments, living fragments. That's then placed onto a microchip base, so every fragment is able to be tracked and traced, and this is a world first. And the fragment will actually grow over that base. So no matter where that fragment ends up, anywhere around the world, in any holding facility, or even put back out on the reef, we can actually work out exactly who it is, where it's come from, the exact environmental conditions on when it was collected, its depth, its temperature, its water chemistry, and then where it goes from that point on. So whether it's put into another holding facility, the central biobank facility, or into a backup holding facility anywhere around the world. From that parent colony, as I said, we're able to get about 10 individual fragments, and every 6 to 12 months that'll double in size, so we actually end up with twice as many fragments every year. And I always say, if this was your bank account, you'd be very, very excited because it doubles. From that parent colony, or from any one of the individual fragments at any point in time, we can take skeleton samples, we can take tissue samples, and we can get unlimited genetics. And this is a bit of a world first for researchers, because historically they had to go out to the reef, try to look for a particular species that they were after, which is very hard to do. And there's only about 5 or so people in the world that can actually identify corals to a species level underwater. So it's kind of like a dying knowledge or skill, and it's not being replaced anytime soon either. So they are working on AI type models where you'll be able to take a photo and bring it back to the surface and try to work out what it is. But as you can imagine, being able to get down to a species level underwater is very, very important for lots of different reasons, and particularly for a biobank scenario. But yeah, researchers would historically have to go in the water, try to find that coral, bring them back, get a skeleton sample, get a tissue sample, and then get their genetics. Whereas now they can literally just order coral fragments off a catalog through us, and for the first time ever, have access to the entire species diversity of the Great Barrier Reef under a single roof. So we hope that this collection will actually act as a catalyst for reef research and restoration efforts, because it'll be a resource that's never been seen before. So how do we ensure that everything we collect is actually looked after and safe? So in our central biobank facility, we'll actually keep all the coral species under the one roof, and multiples of those species, which is that top part, and an artist's impression of the ultimate biobank facility that we hope to build. But in addition to that, what we're actually doing is setting up a global network. So if you are someone out there listening right now that has a marine tank in your home or office, you can actually register to look after a living fragment of the Great Barrier Reef, and we'll send you that fragment, and you can put it in your tank. It'll be scanned, you'll get it at your end, you'll measure it, you'll check its health regularly, and it'll become part of the biobank system. So what we've tried to do is kind of like Uber is the largest transport company in the world but doesn't own a vehicle. We are basically taking advantage of the world's marine tanks in existence through public and private aquariums, and which there's over 2 million tanks currently operating at a very, very high level. So this is where we'll set up our backup fragments. So as I said, that collection doubles every 6 to 12 months. So every time we get a fragment that's fragmented, that'll go out to a public or private aquarium to look after. So this gives us ultimate resilience. So no matter what happens to our central biobank facility or any one of those individual private or public tanks, we'll still have backup fragments of that genetic material somewhere around the world. So that's really, really interesting. And it means that everyone can take part. But if you don't have a tank, you can also, I guess, sponsor a coral fragment within our central facility. So you can become a mum or a dad or a grandma or a grandpa for a living coral fragment of the Great Barrier Reef, and you can do that right now. So if anyone's interested, you can jump on the website and actually sponsor a coral species, which is very, very cool. So everyone can play. We have an amazing list of partners from all around the world. People really from industry who are making this happen. And that's one of the reasons we're able to move so quickly, is that we can actually work with industry, particularly the coral collecting industry who supply public and private aquariums, to be able to go out there, work with them to collect the corals, to keep them alive in the land-based facilities. And these are the people that have been doing this for so long. So they have the knowledge, they have the experience. We're just really bringing all this together, which is yeah, a bit of a world first. We're working with Indigenous partners here in Australia. We're working with council, a range of engineering organisations to set up the facilities. So yeah, it's a great little project with some great people who are willing to do good things for corals and coral reefs. Right now, we have a partner emerging who's a very strong ally, Cairns Aquarium. So if you come to North Queensland, and some of you will be coming over to Australia here on the next expedition, chances are you'll go to the Cairns Aquarium. They've offered an in-kind space within the aquarium to actually allow us to set up our second holding facility. So right now, we're currently building 2 holding facilities capable of holding 20,000 live coral fragments, and one of those facilities will be in the Cairns Aquarium. It will be publicly accessible, and you'll be able to go and see those coral fragments doing their thing and being looked after. So yeah, very exciting to be able to partner with Cairns Aquarium and really scale up this project very quickly. So as you can imagine, Cairns Aquarium has a huge infrastructure support system and team that we will tap into, and it really allows us to scale this up much quicker than if we were to build something from scratch. We are well on our way to getting this sorted, and as you can see, that photo up on the right is at one of our partner facilities, and you can see all the coral fragments being held. So, you know, none of this is theoretical. This is all being put into practice right now, and that's what makes this project so exciting, is that unlike the ones I showed you early on that were looking at 1 or 2 species and that were, you know, 2, 5, 10, 20 years coming off in fruition to being applicable to a regional scale of corals, of coral reef restoration, what we're actually doing is able to collect the entire species biodiversity right now, and we're out there collecting as often as we can. So this is well underway. So we only launched in 2019, so it's been a very quick progression for us. We got some seed funding, believe it or not, from an anonymous Dutch foundation who just wanted to make sure that the Great Barrier Reef was looked after, so they gave us some money to get this started. We created a business case, and then we created really strong partnerships with traditional owners, research institutes, industry experts, government, and local business to allow us to move as fast as we possibly could. We've got about $4.8 million of in-kind contributions, including a land parcel to build our ultimate biobank facility, which is amazing. So lots and lots of really goodwill and I guess you know, support from everyone out there who just wants to make this happen. And that's what I love so much about this project is you know, you tell people about it and they just want to help. And I think that's you know, something just so rare in conservation. It's often a very hard sell, whereas this project is a very easy sell for us, and people just want to make sure that the Great Barrier Reef is being looked after. Right now we have 85 species of coral, or just over 22% of the biodiversity looked after in our holding facilities. And as I said, we're just about to have the two other holding facilities come online. So by probably June this year, we'll have the ability to hold 20,000 fragments, in which case we'll really ramp up our collecting activities. And what's really interesting is that we've been running expeditions, tourism style expeditions that some of you will have been on, where people can come out and actually watch us collect the corals and be part of that collection process. So not only are you visiting the Great Barrier Reef, having a great time, going diving, snorkeling, but just by coming out with us, you're contributing to the coral collecting activities and assisting in that biobank collection. So people absolutely love that. We've had the biobank project showcased on various TV shows, but one of them in particular was ABC Australian Story, and I should send Kendall the link actually so she can put it up so you guys can check it out. But it was a 30-minute piece that went out on Dr. Charlie Barron, who's the center of that picture, about his life and career and about the Biobank project. And in the week following that, we had $200,000 of donations from viewers around Australia, because we don't get any government support for this. So it was amazing to see the Australian public just stand up and go, yes, we are behind you on this, and we are going to make it happen. So again, the support and the in-kind contributions are just incredible for this project. So what are our priority actions? How do we actually do this? So right now, as I said, we've got the holding facilities being built. We're creating a database so we can keep track of all those fragments all around the world. We're also coming up with a campaign on how to, I guess, get more coral sponsors. This is our I guess, main revenue stream. So as people adopt or look after coral fragments, either within their home tanks or sponsor a fragment within our facility, that actually gives us the ability to then put money towards more collecting and maintenance and care of the corals. Obviously, we want to get out there and collect as many corals as we can, and our plan is by the end of 2025 to actually have all 400 species of Great Barrier Reef corals collected. Then the sponsor program is what I was talking about. We want to actually secure 1,000 sponsors, which will give us project sustainability or financial sustainability, and that's what all this is about, really. We don't want to have to keep on looking for sources of money to look after these corals and continue to collect. But if we find 1,000 coral sponsors, we can actually be fully financially sustainable in this project, which is quite amazing that we can get to that point with just 1,000 people. So hopefully there's 1,000 people around the world that actually want to sponsor a little coral fragment. And then beyond that, we want to scale. We want to expand our sponsors. We want to build larger holding facilities, and then we need to collect the multiples of each species. So yeah, it's a big vision. It's a big project, but we are very, very excited and well underway. This is the Biobank facility artist impression from our engineers and architects for the Port Douglas venue. This actually went to the World Architecture Awards in Germany, and we were a finalist, which is very, very exciting. If this building goes to construction, it'll be the most energy efficient and sustainable building of its kind anywhere on the planet. And it's fully designed to actually use as little energy as possible, or be carbon neutral, really. So what we wanted to do is create a facility that looks after corals that doesn't contribute to global warming or climate change through its construction or through its energy and maintenance. So yeah, it's a very advanced building. And for that reason, the Climate Council here in Australia, which is an independent, I guess, organisation that tries to improve the situation in terms of climate change and as well as media and exposure, said to us, look, if you're going to go and build that world-class facility, we want to be part of it. We had engineers and we had architects from all around the world contribute to the design of this, and they gave us a free architectural and engineering report to the value of about $250,000, because again, they just love this project. So yeah, it's just been great. And this would be the artist impression of what it looks actually inside that venue. So you can come and visit as a tourist, as a student, and actually see the world's coral species in one venue, which, as I said, has never been done before, and it will be an ultimate resource for the conservation of corals and biodiversity, but also an amazing resource for reef research and restoration efforts. So that's me. I'll wrap it up there, and I'll be very, very happy to take questions. So I'll stop sharing and we'll go back.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean. This is really fascinating and promising work that you're doing. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. Before I start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question today, you can submit it in your control panel under the questions field. And also, if you're interested in traveling to Australia with us, you can check out our website for the trip details or give us a call to speak to an adventure specialist. And Bruce will actually be discussing our trips in his presentation next week, so do join us for that. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the Great Barrier Reef legacy and the Coral Biobank, I will provide links to those in the replay notification. All right, first question. What kind of recognition has the Coral Biobank project had in Australia and internationally?
That's a really good question. I guess we have had a lot of media attention. I think because we're doing something that's so tangible and easy to understand, the media has responded very, very well to this. And it's funny that the media around the world has almost been better than nationally here in Australia. But we recently entered a thing called the Extreme Tech Challenge, which is a global startup competition that's addressing, I guess, the UN sustainability goals. And we won the Australian final last week in basically the Living Coral Biobank project in addressing the issue of sustainability and biodiversity in our oceans. So it's a good recognition that we're well on our way. Yeah, we're excited to enter the international round now and see how we go. But just happy to have that level of recognition that yes, we are on a trajectory that's actually going to make a difference.
That's great. So next question is, there's actually been a lot of interest in how people can actually participate and assist this project. So what can the NatHab guests do to help you out?
Absolutely. I guess if you have a tank at home or have connection to someone who has a tank in their office or home or a public aquarium, please get in contact via the web sites that Kendall will put out, and you can register your interest to actually look after a physical live coral fragment. If you don't have access to tanks, then we'd love to see as many coral sponsors as possible, and Kendall will send out a web link for that, and that's where you can actually sponsor, or I guess virtually host a little coral fragment. So when you do that, you become the sponsor for that individual coral fragment. And don't forget, it's got that little microchip. We'll send you all the information on where that coral fragment was collected, which reef, the GPS location, the depth, the time, the water chemistry, where it's being held right now, its growth rates within the holding facility, and you'll be able to see that grow over time and actually give rise to other coral fragments. So that's a really important program for us, and we'd love to see as many coral sponsors from this webinar as possible. That would be really, really cool. We'd really love that.
Yeah, it's such a cool aspect of that project. Okay, next question is, how does the frequency being emitted from the RFID chip influence the coral fragment?
Not at all, no. So when you put the RFID reader over the RFID chip, it basically cites that chip for a microsecond, and the reading is given. So it's not like the chip is actually constantly giving off a frequency. We haven't tested it, but I've worked with these microchips in a range of different animals, from seals to sharks, penguins, fish, turtles, and so far I've seen no negative impact. But it's a really good question, actually, and it's one that I haven't actually considered before. But yeah, I suspect very, very low.
Okay, great. If we continue to heat and our oceans and more acid is introduced to them, where will we transplant these collected coral species?
Very good question. And just to give, I guess, the viewers a bit of background on that, ocean acidification is obviously another emerging and unfortunate impact of global climate change. And as the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide, it becomes more acidic. And what that actually means is things with a calcium carbonate type skeleton, which corals do have, their skeletons are actually not as densely formed. And as you can imagine, an acidic type ocean actually dissolves that material. So in future scenarios in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're expecting ocean acidification to be a little bit stronger than it is now, which may impact, you're right, coral growth. But the bigger impact really is on the plankton of the oceans, all those little organisms that have a tiny, very delicate, I guess, calcium carbonate type structure that will literally, kind of dissolve within this more acidic ocean. It's certainly not something that I can allow for or factor into when we're actually holding the corals in the facility. And all we can do is keep those corals alive and hope that in the future, when they are being replanted, conditions are acceptable to do that. But there's no guarantee at all. But I guess what this project really is an insurance policy. It's kind of hedging our bets and giving ourselves a bit more breathing space. So as these bleaching events continue, we continue to lose individual species, but if we collect them and hold them and keep them in the biobank facility, we at least have them. And I think that's what this is about, is we want to make sure that we have a replica of what's out there in the oceans right now to do anything in the future that we may or may not have created already, in the hope that we can rebuild reefs. But there's no guarantees. There's, absolutely no guarantees. But unless we have this living stock, we won't be able to do anything. So that's what this project is really fundamentally about.
Absolutely. So this next one came in a little early on in the presentation. He writes in, the elephant in the room is this week's UN evaluation of the Great Barrier Reef and potential downgrade as a heritage site. What are the implications of that in terms of greater loss of protection?
Really good question. I guess the UN's decision is kind of twofold and two-pronged, and it could go either way. If it's downgraded to in danger, it will put more pressure on the Australian government to actually do better things, which is not a bad thing at all. I don't know if people watch the news very often, but our Prime Minister is very pro-coal and very pro-opening new coal mines and power plants that are fueled by coal and fossil fuels. We have lots of oil and gas. We have lots of subsidies for big companies, tax exemptions. Really, we are an absolute haven if you want to create or use fossil fuels or send them somewhere else in the world. So this puts additional pressure from a global audience and global peers to say, come on, Australia, pick up your game. This is not good enough. You're losing one of the world's greatest natural assets. And it's not us entirely on our own, of course. This is a global issue, and we are all global emitters. But because we are the custodians of the Great Barrier Reef, it puts extra pressure on us. And I think it's very timely that the Australian government really needs to change their tack, because we're living in the dark ages, I think, in terms of our conservation or our caring for country and willing to actually step up and do something really good for the environment. The flip side of that is the potential loss of tourism, which I think is really devastating. And that could go either way. And people could either think, well, the Great Barrier Reef is slowly deteriorating, we better go see it before it's too late, or they'll say, look, it's already too late and we won't go and see it. So one of the things that the Great Barrier Reef needs is tourism, absolutely. It's the single biggest economic driver of this region. It contributes $56 billion to the Australian economy, and it relies on a healthy reef system and people continuing to visit. So I think, ensuring that people continue to come is really, really important. And one of the things I really want to sort of stress is that, yes, we have had lots of bleaching events in the last 6 or so years, but there are so many areas of the Great Barrier Reef that are still in really, really good condition. And that's why I continue to do what I do, is that I have great hope that the Great Barrier Reef is big enough to, reseed and be resilient enough to make it through I guess the next couple of decades while we try to put in these intervention style measures and address climate change. So, I guess my message to you is don't think about not coming, because the Great Barrier Reef is absolutely worth seeing. And if you've never seen it before, absolutely come and have a look. But tourism is a really important driver in the conservation of the Great Barrier Reef. And if people stop coming, and if that economic driver disappears, then the government almost has, you know, a green light to go, oh, well, we did our bit. You know, it's not as important as it used to be. We'll just continue what we're doing with, I guess, using fossil fuels. And the funny thing is that the Great Barrier Reef was actually protected back in the 1970s because the government was thinking about oil and gas exploration on the Great Barrier Reef. And, you know, conservationists back then actually stood up and said, wait a sec, you can't go and, you know, explore for oil and gas on the world's largest living, you know, ecosystem or structure. So thank God for, you know, conservationists, for people who just stand up and say no. Because if they didn't, we will have had, you know, the Great Barrier Reef being mined for oil and gas for a long time already. So yeah, keep coming. It's still very, very beautiful, but under threat. It is, I think, in danger.
Mm-hmm. So what is the relationship of coral reefs and kelp forests, or, you know, predators and grazers in the area? What's the relationship of the coral reef health on the populations?
Really good question. We don't particularly have kelp forests here on the Great Barrier Reef, like you would see in California, for instance. I'm thinking they're mainly down south, or they were. We have had huge kelp forest dieback here in Australia due to water temperature as well, which has absolutely been devastating because they haven't regrown. So it's just another, I guess, hint that we're you know, reaching a tipping point here. But in terms of, I guess, kelp production, or you know, macroalgae production on the Great Barrier Reef, and that in contrast to coral production, we're still very much in the coral side of the scale. So things are looking quite good here. As I said, we have lots of herbivores left. People on the Great Barrier Reef really don't fish for herbivores, which is very, very thankful. Which means that when we do have a big algal type of bloom, it's kept in check by all those herbivores. And what you see after a bleaching event is really this, you know, boom of herbivorous type of fish, you know, surgeonfish, parrotfish, anything that feeds on the algae actually doubles in numbers, and they respond very, very quickly to that boom in algae, and then they'll retract again as the algae sort of disappears. So thankfully they're really, really important to our ecosystem. But if you've been to other places around the world where fishing pressure is very, very high, and they're taking everything from the top predator all the way down to the lowest little fish, places like Papua New Guinea that I visited, for instance, you know, the kids will be out there shooting little fish with bicycle spoke spear guns that they make with like a little elastic band. So they're fishing at the very, very lowest level, while their dads and brothers and grandfathers are fishing for tuna, and then everything in between is taken as well. So that is a really bad scenario for a coral reef situation. And as you can imagine, if a bleaching event goes through there, then you've lost that coral habitat, and then everything breaks down and there's really nothing left. So that's why it's really, really critical for those billion or so people that rely on coral reefs, that, you know, we don't continue to see these mass bleaching events where you can effectively lose a coral reef in a month or two. And that's the reality of this. That's how quick it is. So it's quite scary.
So I'm going to bring it back to the Biobank, and for those who want to participate at home, can you talk a little bit more about that process? Someone here is curious about whether or not there's any sort of training before someone gets started.
Yeah, what we recommend is that you have had a tank for quite a while, and there will be prerequisites if you want to look after a physical fragment, and you'll have to meet basically a criteria to show that when you receive your fragment, you're not going to effectively kill it, and that's what we don't want to see happen. So anyone with a tank with a track record of that tank will be viable to look after a fragment. But if you're thinking about going out and buying a tank just to look after fragments, I'd probably suggest against it. It's quite a skill and a technique, and it takes a little bit of you know, getting used to, probably, you know, 6 months to 12 years before you're ready to look after a fragment. But if you're really, really keen and want to be part of the project, please jump on the website. Please become a coral fragment sponsor, because that is ultimately even more important to us, because that gives us that funding stream to go and collect and actually look after the fragments that we've already got. So by all means, if you want to look after a living fragment, register your interest on the website. But failing that, or in preference to that, become a coral host, because or a sponsor, because we'd love to have as many of you looking after our fragments within our holding facility as possible.
Mm-hmm. So if someone wants to actually have a fragment in their own tank, should they still have their fish or other marine life in the tank, or should the fragment be on its own?
You can have it in the tank with other things, and people who have tanks at home generally have fish and corals together. It's certainly not a bad thing, depending on the coral species that you receive and whether you've got like a butterfly fish, for instance, that actually eats the coral. That's probably something to check. But certainly, yeah, we see tanks with a variety of species in them. So you don't have to have an isolated, biosecure tank just for the corals.
Okay, great. Well, I am going to call it there with questions. Thank you so much, Dean. This was, again, super fascinating and really exciting stuff that you're working on. So thank you so much for getting up early and presenting to us. I'd like to hand it back over to both you and Bruce for closing comments. So we'll start with you, Dean.
Well, thank you for everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate the opportunity to present. And each time I do this, it just reinforces that we're on the right track, and it also helps us find those new coral sponsors. So we're very excited. When you come to Australia, please look us up. If you're coming out with the expedition and you go to Cairns Aquarium, chances are you'll see some of our fragments. Enjoy your time in Australia. It's an absolutely amazing place. And please do continue to come and visit the Great Barrier Reef, because it is absolutely amazing. And I'd hate to think that you think that the Great Barrier Reef is dead and it's not worth coming to, because it's certainly not the case.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Bruce.
Hey, Dean, one quick question. You mentioned that there are perhaps only 5 coral researchers in the world who can identify coral underwater. Are any of them working with you?
Yes, absolutely. So Dr. Charlie Veron, who was in the photo when we were holding the fragments in the holding facility, he is absolutely working with us. He is considered the godfather of corals. I probably should have given him a bigger rap at the time. He actually has described and named over 20% of the world's coral species. So what an amazing accolade to have in your career. And an absolutely interesting career that he's had. And I'll send Kendall the link to the Australian Story episode, because you can watch that 30-minute piece on the life and career of Charlie Veron, as well as the Biobank, and how it's all sort of dovetailing into each other. It's a hard thing to do, to identify coral species underwater, and there's a lot of them on the Great Barrier Reef. There's 400 or so species, so about 50% of the biodiversity is found just here on the Great Barrier Reef. And yeah, it's quite difficult to get down to that individual species level, because not only do you have different coral forms, so you can have branching corals, you can have boulder style corals, but once you get down to individual polyps and the structure of those polyps that will identify one species from another, it becomes very, very difficult. And through this process, we're actually working with Queensland Museum, who will actually take the genetic material from each one of those colonies that we collect and run the genetic sequence. So we'll work out exactly what species we have, and guaranteed we'll probably find, between 20 and 100 new species through this process. So we will actually rewrite the coral species book by doing this project, which is very, very exciting for Charlie, because he came along and he laughs that, he really annoyed the scientists of his time, who were kind of almost, fossil coral experts, because that's all they used to use was coral skeletons. People didn't used to dive, so they'd bring these big trawls up and they'd find all these skeletons from around the world, and they try to classify them according to the structure of those skeletons. Well, he was one of the first people to actually stick a scuba set on and actually get underwater and go, well, I think that's that. Oh no, that looks different under here. And so yeah, he's now quite amused by the fact that it will all be rewritten again by this new science, which is obviously genetics.
Okay, well, Dean, that was really fascinating, informative. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to meeting up with you again soon.
My pleasure.
Over
Absolutely.
to you, Kendall.
Thanks again, everyone. And remember to join Bruce next week when he talks about Australia and how you can travel to Australia with NatHab. Thanks again, Dean. Thank you so much for taking the time to present today. And thanks as well to everyone who joined in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Bye, everybody.
Bye.